Hi, Rod Driver. Welcome back to 10 by 6.
Hi, it's nice to be back.
It is nice to be back. It's brilliant. And this week we're looking at specifically at the role of big companies, big corporations, and their huge influence over politics, both domestically, internationally, but specifically, I guess, in terms of the US predominantly, and how they generally manage to capture the influence and the impact upon our democratic process way more than perhaps they ought to, and certainly way more than the public in general. So over to you, Rod.
Thanks very much. So yeah, we're going to do a couple of sessions talking about what's wrong with our supposed democracy. And so we're going to start this week with the sort of the most important issue, which is the extent of influence by powerful people and organizations, so mostly big companies. So we're going to talk a fair bit about lobbying, public relations, but also about what some people call regulatory capture, where big companies have immense influence over the organizations that are meant to regulate them, but don't actually do a very good job. And so we'll talk about that. And we'll talk a little bit about what some people call revolving doors. So how easy it is for senior people in politics to go into big businesses, and how easy it is for senior people in big business to then get a role in government. And so both groups of people, the politicians, the bureaucrats, and the big companies, start to see the world in the same way, and corporate interests tend to be dominant. So if we start talking about lobbying. So if you ever see research that looks at which are the most corrupt countries in the world, some research will say, oh, Britain and America, they're wonderful countries, they're not corrupt at all. You know, nobody passes a brown envelope full of used notes under a table as a bung to get something done. But in fact, other researchers have found out that there are different forms of corruption, some of which are actually built into the system. So some people call this collusive corruption. And it's when actually the lobbyists from big companies can persuade politicians to change laws in their favor. And then at some point in the future, the politician who's changed the laws in favor of big companies will one day get a very nice, well-paid job with that company. So it's a sort of hidden form of corruption where powerful people collude together. So we talk in Britain and America about political donations. So that's a way of funding politicians and political parties. We talk about favors and we talk about influence. These are all actually just legalized systems of bribery. And people don't really understand the scale of what goes on behind the scenes. So Washington in America, Brussels in Europe, and London are the three main centers for corporate lobbyists. So the lobbyists are the people who are trying to manipulate the laws. So recent research showed there are approximately 25,000 lobbyists in Brussels. And then research in Washington showed that just the financial companies alone employ 5 lobbyists for each politician. So the scale of the industry is absolutely phenomenal. And it isn't just individual companies who do this type of lobbying, it's whole industry groups where they will work together, and they're incredibly powerful. If you imagine how important the financial sector is to any country, it sort of underpins all transactions. Then if you form an organization that represents all financial interests, they have immense sway with politicians and bureaucrats and decision makers. Now, one of the problems with what goes on is that it's extremely secretive. There's really no oversight. They can have private meetings with politicians and bureaucrats where nobody knows who said what to whom, and they can agree very secret deals. And so we've got this situation where we use the word revolving door, as I mentioned in the introduction, where senior people from government and companies move backwards and forwards. So for example, in 2019, the chief lobbyist for Santander, which is one of the big banking companies that had been involved in all sorts of problems during the 2008 financial crisis and afterwards became the head of the European Banking Authority. And then in America, you have lots of senators who go on to become lobbyists. And in fact, we have a similar system in Britain, where we see senior political decision makers going to work for private healthcare firms where they lobby to gradually privatize the NHS. So this is a huge industry. And of course, the biggest companies have realized that they don't really care which party is in power. This is both in America and in Britain, that the biggest companies will make donations to both parties so that whoever gets into power will be persuaded to make laws that benefit big companies. And various insiders have written books and admitted that basically money and wealth buys influence. And former lobbyists have said in America, it's an endless cycle of money for votes. That you arrange what's called a fundraiser, which is a nice social gathering where lots of powerful people in business come and meet up with lots of powerful people in politics, and they have a quiet chat about future policy. But the people in politics know that the fundraiser has been funded by these companies and these powerful people making donations. So we see this process ongoing all the time. Now, in theory, other people are able to lobby the government as well. So you see NGOs that will occasionally go and speak to politicians. But in fact, one study showed the research is better in America than in Britain. But so an American study showed that for every $1 spent by NGOs in America on lobbying, $34 is spent by big companies. So you've got a sort of David and Goliath arrangement that the companies are just able to bombard politicians and lawmakers with lobbying on a daily basis. And NGOs and other members of civil society just don't have the resources to do that. So in some industries, there is actually no organized opposition, that it is the companies who provide all of the influence to lawmakers in terms of how laws and regulations are drafted for the future. And nobody is able to challenge that. And another thing that people have realized with lobbying is that quite a lot of it is very personal. So in fact, every now and again, you'll see in the news that some senior members of the government have gone to visit some billionaire on their private island. So Richard Branson has a private island where politicians used to go, and Rupert Murdoch is notorious for inviting large numbers of politicians to his private island to go and debate policy. So it's just the case that corporate lobbyists, they spend more money, they employ more people, they have more contacts, better inside knowledge, better access to policymakers, and better information. And so all of this ability to manipulate politics essentially undermines democracy. Their voices matter. The voices of ordinary people in general have no influence over policy. Now, the way lobbyists get their activities to be so successful is that they try and get the message repeated over and over again by other sources. So they will continually feed stories to the mainstream media, which will be about trying to get a point of view put forward which will benefit big business. And they will also block negative stories in the media. And then they will also fund universities. So research is carried out, again, which supports corporate interests. And they'll fund think tanks, which are supposed to be independent research institutions. But all the most recent evidence shows that basically think tanks just write whatever their funders want them to say, which will mostly be pro-corporate ideas, talking about deregulation of various industries and so on. So one area that is almost never discussed in the mainstream is another aspect of lobbying, which is government to government lobbying. And this is incredibly important. And so the United States government is actually the most powerful lobbyist in the world. And this is one of the things that Julian Assange and WikiLeaks discovered, that whenever they investigated anything in any other country, what they found was the US government was active behind the scenes manipulating events, trying to persuade lawmakers and regulators in other countries to change their laws, to deregulate, so that American companies could make profits in those other countries. And they have a huge variety of tools to enable them to do this. So they can provide a bribe. So there's a great example where Julian Assange was in the Ecuadorian embassy in London. The government of Ecuador changed, and the Americans paid, or they persuaded the IMF to pay, basically a bribe of $4 billion to the new leader of Ecuador, and Ecuador handed over Julian Assange to the British police to be arrested and put in prison. And so the American government is incredibly powerful all over the world. And if a bribe doesn't work to persuade a government to change its policies, it can use threats, it can use sanctions, and ultimately it can go to war and get a government overthrown. And the CIA, America's intelligence agency, it's been very well documented over and over again, and we've talked about this before, that is quite active behind the scenes manipulating politics in country after country. So this gives immense advantages to American companies. And Britain also does lobbying behind the scenes, and various other advanced nations lobby behind the scenes in other countries. So it provides advantages for their companies. So one of the areas I want to talk about is what's known as regulatory capture. So this is where people who are meant to be regulating the big businesses start seeing the world from the perspective of the big businesses, and they start to think that it's all about corporate profit. And so we sometimes call this ideological capture, and this also applies to politicians. They see the world from the perspective of profit for big business. And so laws will be written and regulations will be written where they're not really holding companies to account. So we saw this most dramatically in the period prior to the 2008 financial crisis. So the regulators were not really regulating the big banks at all, and the banks were getting away with more and more criminal and unethical activities. And eventually the whole system became so unstable, it imploded. And so we see in other industries, quite notably, the pharmaceutical industry is very, very poorly regulated. And it's very interesting that in theory, a regulator does have power to limit the activities of the companies that it regulates. But in general, all it will do is fine the company. It won't throw people in jail. It won't shut the company down. It will give a fine. Now, some of the fines in the pharmaceutical sector have been in the billions of dollars. The crimes of the pharmaceutical industry are enormous, but the fines are never enough to stop the companies doing business. So you essentially end up with a system where companies are basically operating outside any real legal framework. They're above the law. And the companies like it that way, and the regulators and politicians seem to be happy to go along with this. So over the coming weeks, we're going to talk more and more about an economic system that I call Neo-Liberalism. It's a very extreme form of capitalism, but it has certain elements to it that are very important. And so this business about regulatory capture and about having no laws to control corporate activity, these are very important aspects of neoliberalism. So one critical writer suggested that in America, agriculture and food policy is written by Monsanto, one of the big grain companies, that energy and foreign policy is written by ExxonMobil, one of the big oil companies, and that financial policy is written by Goldman Sachs, the most important of the big banks. And in fact, we started to see this very clearly after the financial crisis, because when Obama was putting together his team of regulators and advisors who would regulate banking, it was all the same people who had brought about the financial crisis in the first place. So it's like taking a lot of poachers, pretending that they're going to become gamekeepers, knowing full well that they're actually all still poachers. And so in 2014, there was a great sort of example, which is very well documented, where Citigroup, one of the big financial companies, drafted legislation to ensure that if there were another future financial crisis, they would be bailed out once again, because lots of people had said, hang on, bailing out the banks after the financial crisis, that was a disaster. We should have let them go bust. So now it's written into law that they will be bailed out. And what was notable about all of the political supporters who were pushing this legislation is that they all received large donations from financial companies. So we can see this incredibly close relationship between business and politics. And we start to notice, obviously, that there are conflicts of interest with this system. So in fact, we have accountancy firms who advise governments on how to set up accountancy rules, how to set up tax rules. But then those same accountancy firms go and help their wealthiest corporate and personal clients get around the rules by setting up offshore tax havens and accounts overseas and complex networks of international businesses. So a number of people say, what are the solutions that we could do to limit corporate lobbying? One solution that's been put forward is the idea of registers of lobbyists. And in fact, this is discussed very seriously to make the whole system more transparent. But I think we've mentioned in the past that one of the things that you see with public relations firms is that when they realize a problem is kind of clear cut in the minds of the public and people actually want change, they'll start by recommending solutions that they know will not work. And so the idea of transparency with lobbying won't actually make any difference. People will be aware of more about what goes on, but nobody will stop doing it. And in fact, for a while, between 2005 and 2010, a number of NGOs set up an award that they called the Worst EU Lobbying Award, so that people could see the worst lobbying that went on behind the scenes in Europe. And in fact, they stopped doing it in 2010 because they realized it wasn't actually making any difference. So in fact, if we want to change anything, we really have to dig much deeper and say we've got to change the system. That in fact, there should be no secret lobbying at all. That if companies want to communicate with government about future regulation and so on, it has to be much more limited than it is now, but it also has to be overseen by other organizations, say individuals from the public who might have the public interest at heart, or it must be overseen by NGOs. So in fact, I would introduce rules where all meetings between politicians and corporate lobbyists and corporate representatives were actually recorded and videoed and could be discussed and so on. Even then, you would expect there would still be quiet little cozy meetings at people's private houses and things like that, which were never mentioned. But you have to start by making it clear that this type of thing is unacceptable. So if we look at the way the media covers this type of topic, they will occasionally be slightly critical of very specific things. So for example, there was a fair bit of criticism about what was called cash for honors. So people who'd made donations to political parties were often given honors, knighthoods, and so on. And it was good that this was talked about, but this is a very superficial part of the problem. The whole thing is much, much bigger and deeper in scale. And the media never really engage with the deeper issues. And when it is mentioned in the mainstream media, they tend to conclude, well, there's a little bit of lobbying here and there, but we don't think it has much effect. And that completely ignores, firstly, the scale of this, but also the fact that actually, everywhere you look, you see examples of where this clearly has been incredibly effective. So the most famous situation is the bank deregulation. So for about 50 years in the 20th century, let's say between approximately 1930 and say the 1980s, banks were structured completely differently. Different types of banking were separated out, and the whole system was much more stable. But banks lobbied year after year after year to get these regulations removed. And in Britain in 1987, we had Big Bang. In America, you had other changes in regulations which allowed banks to become bigger and more complex. And it brought the different types of banking together. And it's made the system more and more unstable since then. And that's what eventually led to the 2008 financial crisis. And since the financial crisis, it's lobbying by the financial industry that's actually blocked serious reforms. So I was actually talking to somebody from Europe, from the regulators in Europe, who had talked seriously about separating out the different types of banking once again, but they said that they couldn't persuade enough politicians to support that because of the power of the financial lobbyists influencing politicians. If you look in America, one of the most famous examples of regulatory failure was a company called Enron, which eventually collapsed the California energy markets. And they were able to get away with the crimes that they got away with for a number of years because they had paid money to politicians in Washington to deregulate American energy markets. And it was a complete disaster. And as I've mentioned earlier, we have corporate lobbying in the pharmaceutical industry, which leads to completely inadequate regulation of pharmaceuticals. Now, I often say that American regulators are hopeless. They don't regulate properly. At least they have fined the pharmaceutical industry huge amounts of money for fraud. But if you look at the British regulator for the pharmaceutical industry, it's actually almost never fined any of these companies, even though they're committing the same types of fraud in Britain as they do in America. So regulation is actually slightly worse in Britain than it is in America when we're talking about regulation of big industries. Okay, so I think that's probably quite a good point to stop the presentation and open it up to a sort of discussion, Jason.
Thank you, Rod. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Got a whole load of points as usual. Not quite sure where to start, to be fair. If we start off with if we should further down the line in terms of your discussion presentation, and you talked about the way in which the US bribes other countries. And we've certainly, unfortunately, we've certainly seen that at the UN, where delegates, for example, are basically told by American representatives that if they vote the way in which the Americans want them to vote on the UN Council, that they will still get the loans that the America provides to their country, or still get the support. However, if they don't vote the way, they can't expect those favors in the future.
Yeah.
So it puts those countries in a terrible position where instead of actually voting how they would prefer to vote, they end up only voting as a proxy to the United States.
Yeah, so that's absolutely right. And in fact, William Blum, one of the best critical writers on US foreign policy, who unfortunately passed away a couple of years ago, he used to talk about what went on at the UN and how it was often a case of the United States bribing, threatening, or cajoling other countries to bid in the way that the United States wanted. And you start to realize that whilst we think of an organization such as the UN as this sort of independent body that represents all its members, in fact, as with so many aspects of international politics, it is possible for the countries with the most power, and in this case, we're nearly always talking about America, to manipulate or control events within those institutions. And so in future weeks, when we start talking about the international economic system, we can see that other institutions such as the International Monetary Fund, the World Trade Organization, and the World Bank are all heavily influenced by the United States. And this is really a terrible state of affairs for international politics, because it means that so much of what goes on is really for the benefit of a small group of powerful people in America. A lot of it often tends to benefit a small group of powerful people in Britain and perhaps France and a few other advanced nations, but often it is against the interests of the vast majority of people in most countries. And so it's not a great state of affairs.
And that in itself can lead us to the conclusion, especially linking in with the way in which the bribing takes place from around elections with both major political parties, so that whoever of those two parties is going to win, they've made sure that they've already put their counters in the ring, so to speak. It therefore means that what the politicians become, for want of a better word, are puppets.
So I think that's a great word. And in fact, the term puppet dictator used to be used quite a lot to describe dictatorships in third world countries that were very, very influenced by the United States. I actually have moved away slightly from the word puppet, because a lot of these people are doing what they do a lot of the time because it suits them as well. They are very happy to be bribed in order to do what America wants, because it's often useful to a small group of powerful people in their home country. So I tend to call them client states, where they are very receptive to American bribes in some cases. So it's a sort of mutually beneficial arrangement between powerful representatives of America and powerful elites in their home country.
I wasn't referring actually to those other states. I was referring to the US and the UK specifically, because I believe that both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party, and both certainly the current Labour Party and historically most of the Labour Party, and obviously the Conservative Party, the paradigm, the continent in which they work in terms of policies is a very narrow one, relatively speaking. So therefore what I'm saying is the big corporations are effectively determining the outcomes, and it doesn't matter which of those two political parties in those two countries get the power.
Yeah, okay, I agree with that. So I'd slightly misinterpreted what you said first time around. So you're absolutely right. And you can actually see this incredibly clearly in America, and to a lesser extent, you can see it over here, that let's say with financial policy often is the most easy to sort of spot what's gone on. But the whole of the Republican Party was pretty much in bed with the bankers. And then we started to see evidence of Hillary Clinton from the Democratic Party giving speeches to Goldman Sachs and other bankers saying, ignore what I say in public, that's just for public consumption. I'm going to work with you to control the economy and to work for you, basically. So you're absolutely right. It doesn't matter which of the two major parties gets into power. I think in Britain, that's been slightly less the case at different points over time. But I think now it is very strongly the case. So under Keir Starmer and the Labour Party they have at the moment, where pretty much they're trying to eliminate all left-wing thought, they are firmly entrenched with big business. And the same was very clear with Tony Blair, that actually they saw corporate interests as everybody's interests. And of course, that's not true. And we'll talk about that a lot more in future weeks. And so you're absolutely right that a great deal of what politicians decide is exactly what the companies want them to decide.
Yeah, and it's not just obviously the politicians themselves, is it? It's as you talked about, it's the corporate media's role too. I mean, if you look at the way in which the very, very close relationship between Murdoch and Blair, and obviously, viewers need to understand that Tony Blair is a godfather to one of Rupert Murdoch's children, and how when he left in 2007, he was replaced by Brown. But what you also saw then was a shift by Murdoch away from supporting the Blairite Labour Party to supporting the up-and-coming Cameron in the Conservative Party. So he and the same when when Ed Miliband took over from Brown, very much Murdoch stuck with the Cameron Conservative Party, and they won power. And if you look at the influence, for example, of Murdoch, he's pretty much determined every general election in this country since 1974 in relation to how his papers, certainly The Sun, but certainly the way in which the narrative, the ideological narrative, is sown behind the scenes and through the clever use of language and manipulation. So he's tied his flag to the mast accurately, if you want to call it that.
Yeah.
To every single prime minister since 1974, which in itself is, and we'll talk about this obviously in the upcoming weeks, an absolute travesty for democracy.
Absolutely right. And I think it's really interesting when you start looking at the role of people like Rupert Murdoch and their relationship to politics, and you realize the extent to which the media can play a role in influencing political outcomes. And of course, as we've said in previous weeks, most of the media is either privately owned by billionaires and other wealthy groups, or it's the state system that has very much a sort of ideological bias in favor of existing systems, whether that be warfare or corporate structures. And it means there is very, very little scope in mainstream systems to challenge those ideas.
Yes, and I think also, Rod, we need to take into account very seriously the influence that they all have, whether it be the corporate media, the lobbyists, the governments, in relation to the two major events, I think, that have happened in the last 50 so years, and that is the role of the IMF in 1976, in which it argued was a reaction to the OPEC crisis in 73. But what it allowed, just like in 2008, what it allowed was an ideological reset, because what we had after 1976 was effectively well over a decade of austerity. And what we've had since 2008 is well over a decade of austerity. So it seems very much it's an ideological reset to enable the governments to extract as much money as they possibly can from the public, whilst at the same time reducing the public services, which are very much essential to many people within those societies.
Yeah, so I think that's a really good sort of point, and you'd need probably a whole hour to sort of discuss that seriously. And in fact, later on, one of the things I'm writing about is sort of what you might call power through controlling the narrative and controlling ideology and so on. But you're absolutely right that we have had since 2008 this austerity, and they do it on the back of the crisis, which was 2008. They claim they have to do it, and much of the media goes along with this without serious challenge. And yet there was a whole other set of ideas that we could have been discussing, and we should have been discussing, about how we go forward after the 2008 financial crisis, but they never really got aired because there was this sort of control of the narrative.
Yeah, and also I don't think you will remember, but the letter that the Tories really made a meal of, so when they came in 2010, was the letter that said, that there's no money left. Yeah, but the thing is, that is a standard Treasury letter that happens every time governments change, and yet this is the only time that they really decided to go for it, because what it did, it allowed them to push that ideological austerity onto the British people whilst blaming the previous government.
Sure. So I think it is interesting how a little thing like that, which could have kind of just sort of disappeared and never ever been mentioned by anyone seriously, became this thing that pretty much everybody heard about because the mainstream media amplified it over and over again. Yes. And this is one of the things that we've sort of mentioned a little bit in the sort of failings of the media and the propaganda discussions that we've had in previous weeks, that in fact, you can take very, very small things and blow them out of all proportion. And so that note would be a great example of that. And yet you could have these really huge kind of what I call elephants in the room, because that's what I call my writing. And they can never be discussed. You know, they can not exist at all. And so this kind of powerful influence by the media is really, really quite important for people to grasp. I think it doesn't matter how many times you tell people about the power of the media and the power of propaganda. I suspect that it takes years and years for most people to really grasp the power they have. And in fact, I think it's worth noting this in relation to the last election in 2019 and Jeremy Corbyn, that lots of people in the Labour Party on the left have various kind of ideas about what went wrong in the run-up to those elections. And they might mention the media in passing, but they don't see it as having played an important role. And yet when someone who kind of studies the media looks at what went on,
absolutely,
the criticisms of Jeremy Corbyn over and over again, and they focused on a small number of issues and they hyped it and they hyped it. And some of this, you know, if you throw enough mud, it does eventually stick. And so what was always interesting is that whenever anybody discussed Jeremy Corbyn's policies or the Labour Party policies at that time in isolation, just as policies, they had very, very widespread support. But once they were attached to Jeremy Corbyn,
absolutely,
because of the way the media were able to influence people and smear him, then people reacted negatively. And I think it does take a long time for people to grasp the true power of propaganda, of the media, and of our general understanding of the world. And it's very, very easy for powerful groups like the media, like politicians, to smear somebody else. And one of the sad things that I feel about the way people think in general is that people can agree with 99% of what somebody says. But if they strongly disagree with 1% of what that person says, then they could say, oh, no, I don't like that person.
Yeah.
And so often they end up supporting politicians against their best interests because of the way information has been distorted and presented to them.
No, absolutely. Absolutely. It's also, I think it's important to remember that when it comes to the corporate media, it's not just about the owners, it's about the cultural, social, economic backgrounds of the editor, the sub-editors, and many of the journalists, and that they come from a fairly similar bubble, very similar background. And therefore, because they're not coming from, you know, working class roots and being able to empathize and understand the nature of what people are experiencing on a day-to-day basis, they're coming from public school, grammar school, more affluent backgrounds where those particular lives are more abstract. And I think that's a massive issue too, because it's much easier to mold, if you need to mold these journalists into a particular ideological format, because they've already pretty much learned and experienced that from childhood upwards, which is why I think the corporate media isn't full of working class people.
Yeah.
Whereas the independent media, interestingly, is much more inclined to go for working class people, because they can actually tell these stories and relate to the people, which the corporate media hasn't really got a particular interest in, has it? It's much more interested in identifying what will make people buy their paper or click on their article, and constructing some, a narrative or a story around that in order to bring them in. So it's more about creative writing for the corporate media, as opposed to revealing reality. And so I think that really works hand in hand with the big corporations, with the politicians, with the system in order. And I think going back to the point you were making earlier about taking years and years and years to get people to understand the propaganda. The ultimate problem there is our education systems. Our education systems don't teach people to be critical and analytical and evaluative, certainly from a very early age. They do more so in the universities or possibly in A-levels, but very much the education system needs to have a radical overhaul in order for people to see what's outside the window instead of the veneer that's being provided for them.
So I would agree with that. So you made quite a lot of points. One of the things about the sort of the recruitment processes of newspapers and the BBC, most notably, I remember seeing a documentary where the BBC cut down its recruiting list because it got a lot of applicants to just those who'd been to Oxford, Cambridge and Durham. So you had a large swathe of privately educated people and those who'd been to grammar schools and upper middle class people. And those are, as you say, those are the people who dominate in our mainstream media. And it's not just the media, but it's everybody from those backgrounds.
Yes.
It's incredibly difficult to persuade them to take an interest in what is wrong with our society for the poorer half of our population when they have no experience of the lives of the poorer half of our population. They live in affluent areas, they're surrounded by friends and colleagues who are equally affluent and so on. To them, it's another world. And they have this tendency to say, well, everybody that I know is doing all right. If other people are less successful, it's because they're lazy or stupid.
Yes.
And if they completely ignore most of the time all of the structural issues which make it easy to stay rich if you're born into the right family, and to make it incredibly difficult to get to get ahead in life if you're born into the wrong families.
Yes.
And you know, this is something we need to talk about much more. And you're absolutely right about the education systems, and that oddly enough, even in at university level, where people are taught critical thinking in their own subject, the evidence indicates that they're still not able to apply critical or questioning thinking in other subjects, simply because they don't know what the critical arguments are in those other subjects. They just don't have access to the information. And it takes a long time to find the critical views, because most of the time, if you go looking for them, each critical article is drowned out by a dozen articles or a dozen books that support the mainstream view.
Yes.
And so it's, you actually have to do a lot of digging, or somebody has to show you where to start digging, or give you. So that's why I write these beginner's guides, and that's why we're doing these 10x6 presentations.
Absolutely.
To at least give people a head start in understanding the critical arguments with our society. And so today is the first of a number that we'll be doing, which are critiques of democracy. And if you go to university to study political science, there's hardly anyone doing serious critiques of democracy. Most of the lecturers buy into the idea that democracy is the best system we can possibly achieve in politics, and it works pretty well in Britain and America and in many other countries. Well, that's not really very true. It doesn't work very well in Britain and America, and most mainstream academics, it would be so good if more of them could be persuaded to think more critically about what's going wrong. And the interesting thing is, when I've spoken to academics who teach politics and international relations at university, in their reading lists that they give to their students, somewhere there will be an article by a very good academic, which is a critical academic, and they'll say, democracy is not working in America. It's really, and they'll use another word like plutocracy, or rule by the rich, rule by the powerful, and so on. And their whole article will explain why that's true. But this will never be given much weight by most of the lecturers. This is the problem. So they are aware there are critical ideas out there, but they're not really engaging with them seriously in a way that might one day bring about change in the future.
Yes, no, absolutely. And you're absolutely, that was the point I was going to make, actually. We have adopted a completely inaccurate term when we call the US and the UK democracies. They are something else. Whether it's a plutocracy, or whether it's oligarchies, or whatever it might be, it is something else. But it obviously suits the mainstream elitist agendas to keep repeating the term democracy, to make them sound like they're above, they're more superior to other nations, and that they have a system that they perceive works. And until you give people the tools, they're not going to be able to stand up and say, you're talking utter rubbish.
Yeah. So that's absolutely right. What is interesting, if you look at a topic like democracy, with some topics, so Britain and America committing war crimes, you will see protests in the streets occasionally. And 20 years ago, we did see millions of people marching against the invasion of Iraq, right? But you never see protests saying democracy isn't working in Britain or democracy isn't working in America. So to the vast majority of people, it's never even occurred to them that there is a possibility that the democratic systems are not really working. And so it's a real uphill struggle to engage with them at all in any meaningful sense, because they've absorbed to a deep subconscious level that all the information that comes from the mainstream saying, yeah, isn't Britain great? Isn't America great? We have these democracies and they're working wonderfully. And if that's absorbed at a subconscious level to the point where you never question it, it's really hard to engage people with critiques of that. Because one of the things we'll talk about in a future week is psychology, where people feel very uncomfortable when you present them with information that challenges deeply held beliefs. And so a concept like democracy, everyone so believes in it. It's the norm. It's taken for granted that it's sort of the received wisdom. Nothing else can be so. So it's a real challenge to get people to even begin to know how to question these things.
And it goes back to what you've said earlier. Repeat a lie often enough. Just two more points. I think no, it's 3 more points. Sorry. Firstly, do you think that you talked about the fines in America being much more substantial than the fines in the UK? But do you think, given the cozy relationship that exists between corporations, lobbyists, and the government in the US, and the amount of money that they're earning, do you think that even there, those fines are just symbolic? They're just basically giving a public statement to the public that actually something's being done, when in fact it isn't really?
So I think that's true. So I think there's an interesting thing with regulators, in that 1 or 2 regulators or former regulators have come forward and said, look, we would really, really like to hold these people to account. But actually the politicians don't properly give us the tools to do that. They've actually set the regulator up in order to not really be effective. And in fact, there's some history to this, that big, powerful industries have realized that in order to avoid proper regulation, the best thing they can do is to make sure that a regulator is set up that doesn't regulate them properly. And that's essentially what we have. Yes. And so you find there are people in these organizations who really would like to make a difference. And I think sometimes when they're giving them the fines, and as we've said, the fines can be in the billions of dollars, they think they are doing something that might make a difference. But in practice, it's, as you say, it really isn't going to make any difference at all. And to some extent, the fact that a regulator gives a big fine might lead people to think that something is being done to hold them to account. Whereas when you look at the British system, say with the pharmaceutical regulators, if people were to say, hang on a minute, those companies have committed a lot of frauds and the regulator's done nothing, then that might lead people to actually say, we need to completely change this system. Whereas in America, they're sort of hiding that a little bit by pretending to be doing something. So it's difficult to know. So if you had a British regulator that started giving out bigger fines, or more fines than bigger fines, people would then say, isn't that great? The regulator's doing something. But still, actually, that would just cover up what's really going on. So I think you're right. It's a token gesture. Yeah,
I mean, if it was me, Rod, and we were working in the parameters which we've just been talking about as a regulator, I would say, for example, that if a farm or a corporation was found to have dumped toxic waste into rivers, raw sewage into the sea, I basically give them one chance, and if they did it again, I bring them into public ownership.
So I think that would be a great policy. And the interesting thing is, we'll talk more in future weeks specifically about the financial industry and probably the pharmaceutical industry, because these are the 2 most obvious sort of industries that I describe as not fit for purpose. and they commit frauds over and over again. And I think they are crying out, even if they do nothing else wrong in the future, the conflicts of interest that you get when you have the power of these companies and the profit motive is so great that it will inevitably harm society. So the pharmaceutical manufacturers always have a vested interest in exaggerating the benefits of their medicines and understating the downsides and making a lot of profit by doing that. And the financial industry has similar sort of profit motives to do all sorts of things that are mostly they're unethical, but some of them are actually criminal. And it's only by completely removing the profit motive that you have a chance of getting rid of the drive to do things that harm society. So public ownership to me is a sort of no-brainer for these industries. What is quite interesting is that there are some industries, so noticeably the weapons industry, which for all practical purposes do act like extensions of the government. Their behavior would be just as criminal and unethical if they were owned by the government. They are selling weapons to the Saudis whilst they're destroying Yemen and killing lots of people and so on. And so having public ownership by itself is an important first step, but even that may not completely end unethical activity, because sometimes powerful people do criminal and unethical things for motives that go beyond just pure profit. Often it is.
Can I just step in? Sorry, when I say public ownership, don't get me wrong, I wouldn't hand all the power to like the current Tory administration, because there is no point. I would talk about, I'm talking about public ownership. I mean, the public.
Sure. Yeah.
So every major decision, every decision, that goes forward would have to be, the public would hold them to account. And if the public, believed that what they were doing was outrageous or wrong, the Iraq War 2003, whatever, it doesn't happen. It stops. That's what I mean by public ownership.
Yeah, I'm really glad you said that, because I think it's something that's missing from existing discussions about national ownership of some industries. That if you have sort of national ownership, but still have control by a handful of potentially corrupt politicians, then it won't work as well as if we have the system that you outlined, which is proper oversight by the public in general. And I think that's an important layer to add to discussions about nationalisation. So I'm really glad you said that.
Great, and we can talk about that obviously in future weeks in more detail too. I think, that's the thing. Yeah, we talked about lobbying meetings and possibly, well, the recording of lobbying meetings, but your fears that some of the actual main deals would be discussed in a private session. I would argue, going back to my previous point, that the only things that can be moved forward on and proceed are those that take place in a public forum. So you get Westminster Hall, for example, you open it up to the public can come in and the public then witness it, and the public can stand up and say, no, that's not going to happen. They can have lots and lots of votes that can go on for hours and hours and hours, but the only thing you proceed with is the ones that were formally elected by that public panel in that meeting. They can't do anything outside of that. Otherwise, it's illegal, and therefore they're removed and replaced by a body or group of people who will adhere to the public will.
Yeah, well, so I think that's a great idea, actually. I think again, this is the sort of topic that you can sort of discuss at length. One of the things that most disappoints me about our current generation of politicians is that they are supposed to have been elected by us to represent us. But in fact, they realize that when they get into power, they don't have to represent us at all. They just represent their most important constituents, which are the financiers, the people who pay their donations, the corporate the lobbyists and stuff. And so it really gets to the heart of our kind of critiques of democracy, that in fact, we do need to have a system whereby when people get elected, it is fully understood and implemented that they represent all of us. And they have to represent, the poorest half of society as well as the richer half of society and so on. And I think there are these huge questions over our democratic systems that really don't get discussed at all. And it's really important to air them so people really understand actually democracy has to mean more than just having a vote once every 5 years. And this is what we'll talk about next week, that actually democracy has to mean genuinely that ordinary people have a say in how their country is run. And our representatives do have to be accountable, and I mean genuinely accountable to us. They can't just do what they and their rich cronies want. They actually have to do what we, the public, would like them to do.
Yeah, and I think we need to involve in that in future weeks, a discussion about deference, because I think deference needs to be completely remodeled. Because at the moment, it's almost like handing over responsibility to somebody else and then not doing anything for 5 years until you're allowed to walk down to your local church hall and put a cross in a box. Deference needs to be completely changed. It needs to be about knowledge and understanding, not about power and status.
Yeah, I agree. Sorry, go on. I didn't mean
no, Rob, sorry. No.
So, go. I was just going to, I was really glad that you used the word power in that last little phrase there, that it's not about power and status. Though I think the word power is the thing that is missing from so much discussion about so many aspects of our societies, not least politics. And I have this great belief that when people are given power, they have to use it responsibly for the benefit of society. If that doesn't happen, then unfortunately we see the outcomes that we see now, where they use power to enrich themselves and to enrich their cronies. And this is actually sort of like taking us back in time, hundreds of years, to a feudal system, which is all about the power of the few to rule over the many. And the whole point of the transition to democracy was meant to be that actually those that had power would use it for the benefit of the people and of society. So I was really glad you kind of used the word power there.
Yeah, and I think the problem also is, linking back to that, is that a number of the politicians that end up becoming prime ministers, it's amazing when you look at their educational backgrounds and how many have studied politics, philosophy, and economics as a subject, and how many have chosen specific Greek philosophers in order to adhere to, where there are other Greek philosophers that say we should be doing things very differently. But they've gone for the Greek philosophers or the more contemporary philosophers that argue that the responsibility should be in the hands of a small group of people and that we can't trust mass. So that, I think that's a major issue too. Can I just finish off on one point, which I think is probably one of the biggest ironies that we currently have. And it was when you related to the fact that the bailing out of these big companies since 2014 has been enshrined in law. Well, my argument would be there that what we have now enshrined in law is capitalism being bailed out by economic socialism.
Absolutely right. Yeah, it's completely different from what people believe the system is, and it's so. I think I can't sort of phrase it any better than you did. That some people use the phrase socialism for the rich, and it is exactly that. And so everybody else is left to fend for themselves in quite a competitive situation these days. And yet the rich and the powerful, they don't have to fend for themselves. They have the full backing of an immensely powerful government. And strangely, if we'll talk about this, I've got a specific thing that we'll discuss about where wealth comes from and how rich people get rich in the future. And one of the key sources of billionaires and multimillionaires is industries that have massive backing from government. And again, this is an area that is almost never discussed in the mainstream, that the systems by which wealth gets concentrated into the pockets of a few people are entirely wrong. And when people understand them, they immediately recognize how wrong it is. But if it's never discussed, if the mainstream media never discuss it, most people don't understand. So most people tend to think that the economy must be reasonably fair. because that's the general impression that the mainstream media tries to give them. But the idea that the whole system is completely rigged is something that's never engaged with, but people do need to be more aware of it.
And I think, just, the very last point, I think one of the biggest lies that we were sold in the last 40 or 50 years was by Margaret Thatcher around the idea of closing the mines, because she argued ideologically that we should take back public funding from the mines. If they weren't profitable, they close. What does she do then, Rod? She shut these mines, and then she went and bought coal from China, Russia, Romania, and Germany. All of them were heavily subsidized by their governments. So she reduced the funding in this country, and then bought the coal from the highly subsidized socialist economics of other countries. Complete hypocrisy, but it was never, ever informing the public in the corporate media. That was kept way back.
Sure. So I think that's a great example. And the more you kind of dig into these things, the more you realize there is hypocrisy and double standards everywhere. And there is complete misrepresentation of stories in the media. There is so much hidden information that we should be that should be made public, and so on. And you start to realize that the logic of the existing economic system, so as you say, closing our coal mines and then buying from subsidized coal mines overseas and so on, the logic actually never makes any sense once you start to look at it. Yeah. It all falls apart once you scratch below the surface.
Yes.
And so, yeah, we'll talk about that lots more in the future.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Rod. Yet again, absolutely scintillating discussion. And I'll see you next week.
Yeah, see you next week.
Our pleasure. Thank you.
Bye.